She humiliated the quiet man in seat 12A for his cheap clothes. Then he fired her at landing. The Dallas-Fort Worth airport hummed with its usual Tuesday afternoon energy. Business people rushing between gates, families corralling restless children, the constant drone of boarding announcements echoing through the terminals. At Gate C31, passengers waited for flight on scene 53 to San Francisco, a 3.5-hour journey that would prove life-altering for at least 2 people on board. Among those waiting was a man in his early 50s who looked like he had just walked off a farm, or perhaps a fishing boat. His khaki pants were clean but worn thin at the knees. His flannel shirt was faded, the kind you might find at a thrift store or that had simply survived too many washings. His sneakers were generic white canvas, the laces fraying slightly. He carried no briefcase, no laptop bag, just a simple backpack that looked like it had accompanied a college student through 4 years of education before being donated. His name was Thomas Bradford, and despite his unremarkable appearance, he was the founder and CEO of Apex Digital Solutions, a software company specializing in enterprise resource planning systems. His company had gone public 3 years ago and was now valued at $6 billion. Thomas himself was worth approximately $1.8 billion, though you would never know it from looking at him. Thomas had built his fortune on the principle that flashy appearances were a waste of resources. Why spend $500 on designer jeans when $30 jeans served the same function? Why drive a luxury car when a reliable Toyota got you to the same destination? His philosophy extended to all areas of life: function over form, substance over style, value over vanity. Today he was returning to San Francisco after 3 days visiting his elderly mother in Dallas. The visit had been bittersweet. She was declining, her memory fading, and Thomas had spent 72 hours simply sitting with her, holding her hand, listening to stories she'd told 100 times before. He hadn't thought about work, hadn't checked emails, obsessively had simply been present for the woman who had raised him alone after his father died when Thomas was 7. As he sat in the gate area, reading a paperback thriller he'd bought at an airport bookstore, he was oblivious to the stares of some passengers, the snap judgments being made, the assumptions forming in minds around him. One person making such assumptions was seated across the gate area. Her name was Brittany Morrison, 32 years old, and she was the Director of Human Resources for the Northern California division of Apex Digital Solutions, Thomas's company, though she didn't recognize him. Brittany had joined Apex 6 months ago, recruited from a competitor with promises of rapid advancement and a generous compensation package. She had accepted because Apex was prestigious, growing fast, and represented a significant step up in her career. She had moved from Boston to San Francisco, bought a luxury condo in Soma, and had quickly established herself as someone focused on elevating the company culture, which in practice meant instituting dress codes, social protocols, and a general atmosphere of exclusivity that made employees feel they were part of something elite. Her methods were controversial. She had instituted a professional appearance policy that some employees felt was classist and discriminatory. She had organized team-building events at expensive venues that not everyone could afford to attend. She had made comments in meetings about the right kind of people that had landed in HR complaint files, ironic given that she was HR. But Brittany was excellent at managing up. She impressed executives with polished presentations and data-driven arguments. The C-suite executives she interacted with regularly loved her initiatives. What they didn't know, what Brittany carefully obscured, was that her policies were creating a toxic culture among middle and lower-level employees, many of whom felt judged and excluded. Thomas knew none of this. He had been deliberately hands-off with HR, believing that department heads should have autonomy. His chief operations officer, Sandra Kim, had signed off on Brittany's hiring, and Thomas had never met her personally. He knew Apex had a new HR director in Northern California, but he didn't know her name, her face, or her methods. Today, Brittany was returning from a conference in Dallas where she had given a presentation on building elite corporate culture through strategic HR policies. She was pleased with herself, dressed in an expensive Armani suit, carrying a Prada briefcase, wearing Louboutin heels that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. As she scrolled through her phone, responding to emails and posting conference photos to LinkedIn, she noticed the man in the shabby clothes sitting across from her. Her lip curled slightly in distaste. He was exactly the kind of person her policies were designed to filter out, someone who clearly didn't understand professional standards, who probably worked some minimum wage job, who certainly didn't belong in the same space as successful professionals like herself. When boarding began, Brittany was in Group 2 Premium Economy, not quite first class, but definitely superior to the masses in Basic Economy. She boarded feeling satisfied with her status, finding her seat in row 9 aisle seat with extra legroom. The man in shabby clothes boarded with Group 3. Brittany noticed him passing her row, and she made a comment to the woman in the seat next to her. "Can you believe they let people like that on planes? I swear air travel used to mean something." The woman glanced at the man, then at Brittany, and said nothing, clearly uncomfortable with the comment. Thomas, oblivious to the comment, found his seat in 12A, a window seat, in economy class. He had specifically booked economy because the flight was only 3.5 hours, and the $2,000 difference between economy and first class seemed wasteful for such a short journey. He settled in, pulled out his book, and prepared for an uneventful flight. 15 minutes later, as the aircraft was preparing to push back from the gate, a flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight situation. We're overbooked by one passenger in economy, and we're looking for a volunteer to move to first class. The passenger would receive a voucher for a future flight as compensation." Several hands shot up immediately. Free upgrade to first class. That was a no-brainer for most economy passengers. The flight attendant walked through the cabin checking boarding passes of those who had volunteered. When she reached row 12, she stopped at Thomas's seat. "Sir, would you be willing to move to first class?" "We have an open seat in 3B. Thomas looked up from his book. "Is it necessary? I'm perfectly comfortable here." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Rachel, smiled at his response. "Sir, most passengers would jump at a free upgrade to first class." "I understand, but I don't really need it. Maybe offer it to someone else." Rachel was slightly taken aback by his indifference, but she appreciated his consideration. "That's very kind, but you're in the optimal seat for weight distribution based on our current passenger load. If you're willing, it would help us significantly." "Well, in that case, sure," Thomas said agreeably. He gathered his backpack and followed Rachel up to first class. Seat 3B was across the aisle and one row behind Brittany's premium economy seat. As Thomas passed her row, his backpack accidentally bumped her armrest slightly. "Excuse me. Watch it," Brittany snapped, looking up from her phone. "Sorry about that," Thomas said politely, continuing forward. Brittany watched him enter the first-class cabin with disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. "They're upgrading people dressed like that to first class." She flagged down Rachel as the flight attendant returned from seating Thomas. "Excuse me, can I ask why that man was upgraded to first class?" "We needed to move a passenger for weight distribution reasons," Rachel explained professionally. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is that I paid extra for premium economy and you're giving free first-class seats to people who look like they can barely afford basic economy. That hardly seems fair." "I understand your frustration," Rachel said, though her tone suggested she didn't particularly care for Brittany's attitude. "However, operational needs sometimes require us to move passengers. We compensate those passengers appropriately." "Well, it's unprofessional," Brittany said. "Sullivan Airways would never allow someone dressed like that in first class." "This is Apex Regional," Rachel pointed out. "We're not Sullivan Airways, and we don't discriminate based on appearance." The airline name Apex Regional should have been a clue to Brittany, but she was too irritated to make the connection. Apex Digital Solutions had a sister company, Apex Regional Airlines, a boutique carrier that Thomas had started 5 years ago primarily to transport employees between company offices, though it also sold seats to the public to offset costs. The airline was wholly owned by Apex Digital Solutions, which meant it was wholly owned by Thomas. Brittany was flying on her boss's airline without realizing it. As the flight took off and reached cruising altitude, the first-class service began. Thomas was offered champagne, which he declined in favor of water. He was offered a choice of meals, herb-crusted salmon or filet mignon, and he chose the salmon. He ate quietly, reading his book between courses, bothering no one. But Brittany couldn't stop thinking about the injustice of the situation. She had paid extra for a better seat, and someone who looked like he couldn't afford a decent shirt was getting better treatment than her. It rankled. It offended her sense of hierarchy and order. About an hour into the flight, Brittany unbuckled her seatbelt and walked up to the first-class cabin. She stood in the aisle next to row 3, looking at Thomas with barely concealed disdain. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "I don't think we've met. I'm Brittany Morrison. And you are—" Thomas looked up from his book, surprised by the interruption. "Thomas," he said simply. "Can I help you?" "I was just curious," Brittany said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "What you do for a living? I mean, you must have a very understanding employer who doesn't care about professional appearance." Several first-class passengers turned to watch the exchange, sensing drama. "I work in technology," Thomas said carefully. "Oh, tech support? IT help desk?" Brittany guessed her tone, making it clear she considered these lowly positions. "Something like that," Thomas replied, trying to return to his book. But Brittany wasn't finished. "You know, I work in human resources for a major tech company. One of the things we emphasize is professional appearance. We believe that how you present yourself reflects your respect for your work, your colleagues, and yourself. We've actually instituted policies to ensure our employees meet certain standards." "That sounds restrictive," Thomas said mildly. "It's not restrictive. It's professional," Brittany corrected. "We're building an elite culture. We want people who understand that success has a look, a feel, a standard. People who show up dressed like She gestured at his clothes. Well, like you, they're clearly not serious about their careers. Thomas set down his book and looked at her directly. You judge people's career seriousness by their clothes. Of course, Brittany said. It's basic professionalism. If you're not willing to invest in your appearance, you're not invested in your success. And people who can't afford expensive clothes, Thomas asked, they're just not serious. They should make it a priority, Brittany said. When I was starting out, I spent money I didn't have on professional clothes because I knew it was an investment in my future. Interesting philosophy, Thomas said. What company do you work for? Apex Digital Solutions, Brittany said proudly. One of the fastest growing tech companies in the country. We're very selective about who we hire. Culture fit is extremely important. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. And you're in human resources, director of HR for Northern California, Brittany said. I'm responsible for maintaining our cultural standards, which includes professional appearance policies. These appearance policies, Thomas said carefully. What do they entail exactly? Brittany was happy to elaborate. We have guidelines for appropriate business attire. Nothing too restrictive, just basic professionalism. Men must wear collared shirts, preferably button-downs. Shoes must be leather and polished. No sneakers, no athletic wear. Women have similar standards. We also encourage employees to invest in quality accessories, watches, bags, that sort of thing. It signals that you take your position seriously. And if employees can't afford these things, Thomas asked, then they should evaluate whether Apex is the right fit for them, Brittany said bluntly. We're building an elite organization that requires a certain level of commitment. Other passengers were openly listening now, some looking uncomfortable with Brittany's pronouncements. Let me ask you something, Thomas said. Why did you approach me? Why are you telling me all this? Because someone needs to, Brittany said. You're in first class getting premium service and you're dressed like you're going to clean out a garage. It's disrespectful to the other passengers who paid for this experience. I see, Thomas said quietly, and you felt entitled to lecture me about this because standards matter, Brittany said. Because when we let standards slip, everything else follows. Because people like you need to understand that there are expectations for behavior and appearance in professional settings. People like me, Thomas repeated. Yes, people who clearly don't understand professional norms. No offense, but you're exactly the kind of person my policies are designed to filter out. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Ms. Morrison, can I see your business card? Brittany, pleased that he seemed to be taking her seriously, pulled out her card holder, expensive leather, of course, and handed him a card. If you ever need HR advice, feel free to reach out. I consult on the side. Thomas looked at the card. It read, Brittany Morrison, Director of Human Resources, Apex Digital Solutions, Northern California Division. Thank you, Thomas said. This is very helpful. You're welcome, Brittany said, apparently satisfied that she had made her point. She returned to her seat, feeling she had done her good deed for the day, educating someone who clearly needed guidance. Rachel, the flight attendant, approached Thomas after Brittany left. Sir, I apologize for that interaction. Would you like me to speak to her about harassing other passengers? No need, Thomas said with a slight smile. But thank you. Actually, could you do me a favor? Of course, Mr. Bradford, Rachel said quietly. She had recognized him when he boarded the airline's employee manual, included photos of key company personnel, including the owner. Could you ask the captain if I could speak with him after we land? And could you get me the passenger manifest for this flight? Certainly, sir. Is there a problem? Nothing that can't be addressed, Thomas said. Just some company business that's come to my attention. For the remainder of the flight, Thomas made phone calls using the aircraft's Wi-Fi. He called Sandra Kim, his COO. Sandra, I need you to pull all documentation on Brittany Morrison, our Northern California HR director. Employee complaints, policy changes. She's implemented everything. Email it to me within the hour. Is there a problem? Sandra asked. Potentially a significant one. I'll explain when I land. But Sandra, why wasn't I informed about appearance policies being implemented? Appearance policies, I don't know anything about those. Find out. And find out why I didn't know about them. The email arrived 30 minutes later, and Thomas spent the remaining flight time reading through documents on his phone. What he found made him increasingly angry. Brittany had implemented policies that were borderline discriminatory. Employees had complained that the professional appearance requirements were financially burdensome, particularly for lower-paid staff. Several complaints alleged that Brittany had made disparaging comments about employees who didn't meet her standards. There were concerns that the policies disproportionately affected employees from lower-income backgrounds. More troubling, several talented engineers had quit, citing toxic culture and feeling judged on appearance rather than performance. Exit interviews mentioned Brittany by name repeatedly, and yet she had glowing performance reviews from the executives she interacted with regularly, who saw only her polished presentations and impressive data on cultural cohesion without understanding the human cost. Thomas felt a combination of anger at Brittany and disappointment in himself for not staying more connected to HR policies. This was exactly the kind of elitist culture he despised happening in his own company under his name. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Thomas made his decision. After landing, most passengers quickly disembarked, eager to reach their destinations. But Thomas waited, having been asked by Rachel to remain seated. Brittany, busy gathering her expensive luggage, didn't notice. Captain James Rivera, who had been flying for Apex Regional for 3 years, entered the cabin from the cockpit. Mr. Bradford, you wanted to speak with me. Yes? Thank you, Captain Rivera. Could you ask Ms. Morrison from seat 9C to step back into the aircraft? Tell her it's regarding an urgent company matter. The captain, understanding immediately that something significant was happening, walked to the jetway. Ms. Morrison, could you step back into the aircraft for a moment? There's a company matter that needs your attention. Brittany, confused but confident, returned to the aircraft. Perhaps corporate headquarters had heard about her successful conference presentation and wanted to congratulate her. She walked back to the first-class cabin where Thomas was now standing. Yes, what's this about? She asked. Ms. Morrison, I'm Thomas Bradford, founder and CEO of Apex Digital Solutions. Brittany's face went white. You're... what? I'm your ultimate boss, Thomas said calmly. The man you spent the first half of this flight lecturing about professional appearance. The man you said was exactly the kind of person your policies were designed to filter out. Oh my God, Brittany whispered. I had no idea. I've never seen your photo. I don't publicize my image much, Thomas said. I prefer to stay out of the spotlight, which has the interesting side effect of allowing me to see how people behave when they don't know who I am. Mr. Bradford, I am so sorry. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, Thomas interrupted. which is precisely the problem. Your respect is conditional on knowing someone's status. You judge people's worth by their clothes and their perceived position in the hierarchy. I was just trying to help, Brittany said desperately, to give you advice. You weren't trying to help. You were trying to humiliate someone you perceived as beneath you. You wanted to establish your superiority to show off your position and your standards. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed her the documents he had been reviewing. I've spent the last 90 minutes reading about your cultural initiatives, the appearance policies that burden our lowest paid employees, the complaints from staff who feel judged and excluded, the talented engineers we've lost because they didn't meet your arbitrary standards of professional presentation. Those policies were about building an elite culture, Brittany pressed weakly. Those policies were about building exclusionary culture, Thomas corrected. They were about elevating people who look successful over people who are actually competent. They were about creating the appearance of excellence rather than actual excellence. But the executive team approved everything. The executive team saw your polished presentations, Thomas said. They didn't see the human cost. They didn't hear from the employees who felt diminished and judged. That's a failure of oversight on our part, and I take responsibility for that. But you implemented these policies, you enforced them, and you apparently believed they were right. Brittany was crying now, her perfect makeup running. Please don't fire me. I need this job. I moved across the country for this position. I have a condo, expenses. You have expenses because you chose to live beyond your means to project an image of success rather than building actual financial stability, Thomas observed. You're the person you claim to despise, someone who prioritizes appearance over substance. I can change, Brittany pleaded. I can rewrite the policies be different. Can you? Thomas asked. Because 30 minutes ago, you were lecturing me about how people like me need to understand professional norms. You genuinely believed you were right. That kind of fundamental belief system doesn't change overnight. He paused. Ms. Morrison, you're fired effective immediately. You'll receive 2 months severance, more than generous given the circumstances. Rachel has contacted our San Francisco office, and someone is waiting at the gate to collect your company laptop and ID badge. Your final paycheck will be processed according to California law. You can't do this, Brittany said, anger mixing with her tears now. I'll sue. This is unfair termination. You harassed a passenger on an airplane. That passenger happened to be your CEO, and you've implemented policies that have generated dozens of formal complaints, Thomas said. Our legal team is very confident we're on solid ground. But if you want to sue, that's your right. Just know that discovery will be very unpleasant for you. He turned to Captain Rivera. Captain Ms. Morrison is no longer an Apex employee. Please ensure she's escorted from the aircraft and that her company property is collected. As Brittany was led away, still crying and protesting, Rachel approached Thomas. Mr. Bradford, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Don't be sorry, Thomas said. I learned something valuable. I learned that my company has cultural problems I wasn't aware of. I learned that I need to be more hands-on with HR oversight. And I learned that sometimes the only way to understand what's really happening in your organization is to experience it as a regular person. He gathered his backpack. Rachel, please thank the crew for their professionalism. And thank you for recognizing me and helping handle this situation discreetly. Of course, sir. Will you continue flying with us? Thomas smiled. Absolutely. In economy class, wearing my comfortable clothes exactly as I am. The story of Brittany Morrison's termination spread through Apex Digital Solutions within hours. Thomas used the incident as a catalyst for change. He conducted a company-wide review of HR policies, eliminating the appearance requirements and replacing them with simple guidelines. Dress appropriately for your role. Maintain basic hygiene and respect your colleagues, regardless of how they look. He instituted quarterly walk-around sessions where executives, including himself, spent time with frontline employees listening to concerns and gathering feedback. He reformed the HR department, entirely bringing in a new director whose philosophy aligned with his own: judge people by their contributions, not their clothes. Build inclusive culture, not exclusive hierarchy. Treat everyone with dignity regardless of their position. 3 months after the incident, Thomas received an unexpected email. Mr. Bradford, I've spent every day since my termination thinking about what happened and what it revealed about who I'd become. You were right about everything. I've been working with a career counselor and a therapist, trying to understand why I developed such toxic beliefs about appearance and status. I think I was so ashamed of my own humble background that I overcompensated by creating rigid hierarchies where I could feel superior. I'm working on becoming a different person. I've taken a job with a nonprofit that provides professional clothing to people entering the workforce. Ironically, the exact kind of organization I would have dismissed before. The pay is a fraction of what I made at Apex, and I had to move to a much smaller apartment. But the work feels meaningful in a way my previous job never did. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for my job back. I just wanted you to know that being fired was the wake-up call I needed. Sometimes we need to lose everything we thought mattered to discover what actually does. Thank you for holding me accountable, even though it was painful. Sincerely, Brittany Morrison. Thomas read the email twice, then responded. Brittany, I appreciate your email and your self-reflection. Genuine growth is difficult and requires courage. I'm glad you found work that feels meaningful. That's what we should all be striving for, not impressive titles or salaries, but work that makes a positive difference. I wish you well on your journey. Thomas Bradford. He meant it. He didn't forgive her exactly the damage she had done to Apex. Employees was real and painful, but he respected the effort to change to become better. 6 months after the incident, Thomas was on another flight, economy class, wearing his usual comfortable clothes. A young woman in the seat next to him struck up a conversation. What do you do? She asked. I work in technology, Thomas said, his standard answer. Oh, cool. I'm a software engineer at Apex Digital Solutions. Have you heard of them? I have, Thomas said with a smile. It's a great company, the young woman said enthusiastically. The CEO is this low-key guy who never makes a big deal about himself. There's this famous story about how he fired an HR director on an airplane for being elitist and judgmental. It's become like a company legend. Everyone knows the CEO judges you by your work, not your clothes or your status. Sounds like a good culture, Thomas observed. It really is. I wear jeans and hoodies to work every day, and nobody cares as long as I'm shipping good code. That's how it should be, right? That's exactly how it should be, Thomas agreed. He pulled out his book and returned to reading Anonymous and Comfortable, Just Another Passenger on Just Another Flight, which was exactly how he liked it. The quiet man in seat 12A had taught a very loud lesson: that dignity doesn't depend on designer labels, that respect shouldn't be conditional on status, and that the best leaders judge people by their character and contributions, not by their clothes. It was a lesson Brittany Morrison learned the hard way, and a lesson that transformed Apex Digital Solutions into a company where everyone, regardless of appearance or background, could thrive. All because a billionaire CEO wore cheap clothes and sat in economy class and refused to tolerate those who judged him for it.